He is the worst serial killer in Russia's history.
He just liked to kill.
We just wanted to catch him, to stop people being killed.
36 victims. It's so hard for most people to wrap their head around the thought of actually taking a human life and getting away with it. But there are killers out there who have done just that. In fact, there's some that are on the loose right now. The following stories tell the tale of 3 horrific killers that did unimaginable things. These are people who preyed on the vulnerable, betrayed those who trusted them, and committed some of the most unimaginable acts of evil. One of them was a killer who totally got away and became a celebrity for his crimes, which included eating other people. Another loved to kill women, was released from custody to kill some more. And a third confessed to dozens of shocking murders.
まさにその自分がなんでこんなへんてこな妄想を僕だけです。この家族誰もない。だからもしかしたら僕は他の宇宙か次元かからたまたま飛び込んできた隕石のようにガード下に赤ん坊として寝かされていて。
Issei Sagawa was born in April of 1949. He was never a normal person. This man spent his youth dreaming of what it would be like to consume actual flesh. While he was in college, he decided to make his dream become reality. But let's first go back to when Issei was born. He was born in Japan to wealthy parents. He had one brother. His father had a high-power position. While Issei's mother was pregnant with him, she nearly had a miscarriage after a bad fall. He ended up being born premature. He was incredibly small, even fitting into the palm of his parents' hands. He never ended up growing very big. He was very thin and short with small legs. He was well loved by his parents.
何の苦しみも悲しみもなくて、両親も深い愛情で見つめてくれて、広い自然の中で、大切に育てられ、好きな。
Despite his small size, Issei was attracted to taller women with a more Western look. He fantasized about finding what he viewed as the perfect woman. Growing up, Issei wasn't very confident due to his small size, and so he spent a lot of his time reading books. He loved reading so much that he eventually decided to pursue a career in literature. Issei's mother was extremely overprotective of him and sheltered him quite a bit. This could have played a role in his development. Strangely, Issei first found out what cannibalism was when he was just a little boy. As bizarre as it sounds, Issei had an uncle who could celebrate New Year's by dressing up as the cannibal monster that ate little boys. He would terrify Issei by chasing him and his brother around, saying he was going to eat them. Meanwhile, Issei's father would join in on the game by pretending to be a hero that would protect them. Ultimately, the monster would always win, and Issei's uncle would scoop the boys up and lead them over to a giant cooking pot. These games traumatized Issei and affected the rest of his life. As soon as Issei was old enough to read, his favorite types of books were ones that involved people being eaten, either by other people, or monsters, or dragons. Hansel and Gretel was one of his favorites, since it's about a witch that captures and cooks children to eat. He even liked the idea of someone preparing his body to be eaten. He was a smart young boy, and enjoyed school despite being an outcast. The first time he ever thought about wanting to eat someone else was when he was in first grade. He saw a classmate's thigh and thought it looked incredibly tasty. In Issei's household, the topic of intimacy was very taboo, and his parents never discussed it. When his body began changing when he hit puberty, he was terrified because he thought something was wrong with him. His parents had never taught him what to expect about growing up or puberty. Because he didn't understand how intercourse works, he would do a lot of weird, gross things. sometimes involving animals. Once he got a little older, he became infatuated with the female body and read books that discussed it in great detail. At that point, he didn't actually want to kill a woman, he just wanted to chew on one's skin. As disgusting as it sounds, it's believed that cannibalism has actually been going on since way back in history, hundreds of thousands of years ago. In the beginning, it may have started due to a need for food. People may have thought that since an individual was dead, there was no harm in eating their bodies. But today, most people consider cannibalism absolutely horrific and disgusting. It's hard to imagine that anyone would want to do something like that. Most people don't even like to think about it. But not Issei. Issei's fascination with cannibalism was likely connected to some sort of disorder dating back to when he was a child. As an adult, Issei's thoughts of cannibalism were connected to sexual thoughts of women, especially those in the Western world, like Grace Kelly. He loved the thought of eating Grace Kelly.
で、女性に対してはっきりとカニバリズムの妄想を感じたのは小学校4年の時で、非常に奥手で電話をする時も手が震えて吐きそうになりました。でもその子の白いなんとかな太ももスカートから階段を降りる時に見たらやっぱりカニ食べてみたいなっていう。
Eventually, thoughts of violence entered his fantasies. He was obsessed with the thought of killing and eating women. He couldn't even be aroused without thinking about cannibalism and death. He knew that there was something wrong with him. In fact, when he was younger, he actually tried to get himself therapy. He contacted a therapist through the phone, but they would not see him unless he came in person. He was too embarrassed to do that, so he eventually decided that therapy would not be an option for him. It's crazy to think how different his life would have turned out if he had gone through and gotten the help that he needed. When Issei was 24 years old and in college, he began to stalk a German woman. She lived in the same neighborhood as his grandmother and didn't always close her windows during the night. He saw an opportunity and decided to take it. He went to the woman's house and waited outside until he was confident that she was sleeping. He then climbed through the window. His horrific plan was to knock her unconscious with an umbrella and use a knife to cut off a small piece of her body. He would then leave and be able to eat that. But before Issei could attack the woman, he accidentally brushed up against her, waking her up. She saw him and screamed, causing him to run away. In a later interview, Issei said he was charged with attempted assault due to this incident. He didn't tell police what he was really planning to do when he entered the woman's house. Strangely, the charges against Issei were later dropped, and he never had to pay for what he did. Issei would end up completing his master's degree in literature and moving on to a new university in France to get his PhD. Now in Paris, Issei was surrounded by the types of beautiful women he had always fantasized about. On top of that, many of them didn't dress very modestly like the women from back home. It must have seemed like paradise to him. He began finally trying to make his sick dreams a reality by bringing home streetwalkers night after night. His plan was to wait for these women to fall asleep or go to the bathroom, and as soon as they were vulnerable, he would shoot them and eat them. But time after time, he kept losing his nerve and couldn't bring himself to actually do it. There was something in his brain that held him back from pulling the trigger. Deep down, he knew that if he really did it, his life as he knew it would change forever. 2 years after moving to France, Issei would end up meeting a pretty fellow student. Her name was Renee. She was from the Netherlands and had come to Paris to study literature, just like him. He found her stunning and very friendly. He eventually noticed that she would typically ride the same bus home from school that she did. He ended up making chit-chat with her during one of the classes that they shared together, and she brought up the idea of them meeting outside of school at a Greek restaurant along with other people their age. While he wasn't a very social person, he agreed to go since she was going. While they were out eating, a few of the fellow students talked about how they were interested in trying Japanese food. So Issei offered to host a dinner where he would cook food from home for them. But when the night of the dinner arrived, Renee was the only one that ended up showing up. Issei was caught off guard. He hadn't expected to be alone with her that night, but he couldn't follow through with any of the plans of killing her then because he hadn't prepared himself. So the two chatted and the topic of language came up. Renee revealed that she was fluent in 3 different languages. Issei saw an opportunity and ended up asking Renee if she would tutor him if he paid her. She didn't have much money at the time, so she agreed. The next time that Renee arrived at his house to tutor him, his plan was to kill her. Ultimately, he couldn't do it. He felt like a coward because he just couldn't wrap his head around the idea of taking another person's life. He knew deep down that it was wrong. Renee and Issei started getting closer and closer and would hang out frequently. She would come over to his house all the time to share meals with him and tutor him. He had many opportunities to hurt her, and even though he wanted to, he couldn't, at least not for a while. He would overcome his fears about taking a life in June of 1981. Renee had come over to his house for a German lesson. He decided that was going to be the day that he was finally going to do it. While she was seated at a desk with her back turned, he got up, grabbed his gun, and pointed it at her head. This time, he actually pulled the trigger. But shockingly, the gun misfired, and no bullet came out. Renee hadn't even realized what happened. Issei quickly put his gun down and sat down next to her as if everything was normal. He tried to pretend he was interested in the German lesson she was teaching, despite only using the lesson as a way to get Renee inside of his home. Just 2 days later, Issei invited Renee over again. He told her he needed her help recording some German poetry. She agreed. Just as he had done before, he waited until she was turned around while sitting at the desk, got his gun, and aimed it at her neck. He had finally achieved his dream and had killed her. Renee's body fell to the floor, and she began bleeding. As excitement overcame him, Issei actually fainted. When he came to, he took Renee's clothes off and flipped her body over. He now planned to eat. He bit straight onto her buttocks. His teeth weren't powerful enough to get any meat. None of the knives he had in the house would get the job done either, so he went out and got a big butcher knife. No one walking by his home that night could have ever imagined the horrors that were going on behind closed doors. Issei continued cutting until he found a satisfying chunk to devour raw. Finally, having committed cannibalism, he felt more turned on than ever before. He couldn't stop. For the next several days, he continued to pick. In the days after killing Renee, Issei would leave his home to dispose of all of Renee's clothing except for her pants. He kept those as some sort of sick trophy. Eventually, what was left of Renee began to smell badly and attract flies, so he knew he had to move it before people noticed. He ended up purchasing 2 large suitcases and packing her inside. He then called a taxi to take him to the park. The taxi driver helped him bring the 2 suitcases into the car and even commented on the fact that they were really heavy and made a joke suggesting Issei had a body in there. He played it off and said that it was just books inside. Issei took the suitcases to a beautiful lake where he planned to push them out onto the water where they would sink. What he didn't anticipate was that there would be so many people around. They were laying by the water and sunbathing. He couldn't do what he needed to do with all of them watching, so he just kept walking around. He eventually found a slope where he thought he would be able to push the suitcases down to the water without anyone noticing, but they were so heavy and he eventually had to take a break. A man walking by saw what he was doing and confronted him. He asked him what was inside of the suitcases and eventually opened one himself to find out. He was shocked to discover severed feet and what he could tell was part of a woman's body. As soon as he made the discovery, Issei fled the scene. The man screamed out to the people gathered nearby, saying that this man was a murderer. They called the police, who were eventually able to track him down. When they later went to his house, they found pieces of a woman in his refrigerator. He admitted to what he had done and told them that he suffered from mental illness. Issei was brought before a judge and made to explain in detail what he did to Renee. The judge heard his story and found him to be too crazy to actually stand trial. So, instead of being sent to prison, he was sent to a mental asylum where he spent 2 years. The people of France were not very happy that the country was paying money to house a killer that wasn't even from France, and they began to express their displeasure. Meanwhile, Issei's father, who had lots of wealth and power, was formulating a deal with France that would allow his son to be sent back to Japan to live in a mental institution there. France eager to do whatever it took to get this person out of their country, agreed to the deal. Part of this involved France dropping the charges against him. Issei was sent back home to Japan, and when he arrived at the mental hospital, he was evaluated by a doctor. The doctor quickly came to the conclusion that Issei was, although disturbed, mentally stable. He believed that he certainly belonged behind bars. But at this point, since France had dropped the charges, there was nothing that Japan could do to bring him to justice for the horrific things he had done. He was freed and eventually released from the hospital, never having to pay for his crimes. Now, living as a free man, Issei was very low on money.
でそういうふうにもう仕事もなくなってもうないですから収入もないよ。
One day, he ended up being contacted by a local newspaper asking him to write a piece covering a story about a sadist having been recently captured and apprehended. Because Issei was pretty famous at that point for what he had done, they probably expected the article to do quite well, and it did. He ended up making quite a bit of money. As if that wasn't disturbing enough, he was also contacted by another company who asked him to write a comic book about his experience. His book, which is literally about killing and eating a woman, did tremendously well and sold thousands of copies. Issei would end up publishing many other books and continue to become more and more famous. He would even end up being invited to join a prestigious painting club where he would paint lots of pictures of women. He was even invited to be a part of a film. You're probably thinking about how disgusting it is that an incredibly evil killer not only avoided justice, but made a profit off of it. It may help you to know that his money eventually ran out, landing him once again in poverty. He ended up needing welfare.
とりあえず滞納してますからいつ追い出されるかわからない。ここ追い出されたら僕は死ぬしかないと思ってるんでいつ死ぬかわからないからだから生きてる間は嗅ぎつけようと思って。
On top of this, he ended up struggling with health problems and requiring full-time caregivers. He is now 73 and claims he regrets his past decisions. He will die a slow, agonizing, and painful death due to his conditions. This one's about Pedro Lopez, monster of the Andes. Pedro Lopez of Colombia was born in 1949. At the time, the country was plagued by riots and violence. A popular political leader had been assassinated, and a civil war broke loose throughout the country. It was not the time where you would want to be living in Colombia. Pedro was the son of a poor streetwalker. He was the 7th of 13 children. Growing up, his life was very hard. His mother was incredibly overbearing and controlling, but his life was still better at home than it would have been on the streets, where crime was taking over more than ever before. Pedro's life within the safety of his own home would not last long. When he was just 8 years old, his mother walked in on him having relations with his younger sister. She was furious and kicked him out of his own home, telling him never to return again. Pedro walked down the streets alone with nowhere to go, when all of a sudden he was approached by an older man who said he could take care of him. Pedro accepted the offer with the hopes of being taken to an actual home with food and a place to sleep. Instead, he was taken to an abandoned building where the man took advantage of him several times before throwing him back out on the streets. Scarred by this interaction, Pedro then became terrified by strangers. He spent his days sleeping during the comfort of the day and begging or searching for dumpsters for food at night. One day, an American couple happened to notice his disturbingly thin features and decided to take him in. They gave him food and a place to stay and eventually enrolled him in a local school. While they probably felt like they were doing the best thing for him, he ended up getting assaulted by one of his teachers, running away and returning to the streets. Pedro had very little education and didn't really have any trades, which made it difficult for him to find a job. He would get money through begging and stealing. Eventually, stealing caught up to to him after he stole a car, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was only in jail for a couple of days before being violently assaulted by a group of older inmates. It was then that Pedro promised himself that nobody would ever hurt him again. He fashioned weapons that he found in prison and killed each man that hurt him, earning only a 2-year longer sentence and losing most of the sanity that he had left. Pedro blamed his mother for everything that had happened in his life and wanted revenge. After he was released from prison, he would later admit to stalking and killing around 100 young girls around Peru. At one point, he was actually caught by a tribe of men and tortured for his attempt to hurt a young girl. They planned to kill him by burying him alive in sand, but a Christian missionary ended up saving his life by convincing them to turn him over to authorities instead. He would be forced to return to Colombia, where his murderous rampage continued. At one point, Pedro went into a grocery store and tried to kidnap a young girl who was with her mother shopping. Grocery store workers helped the girl's mom and chased him down. He was eventually taken into custody. While Pedro was behind bars, he declined to answer police questions. They ended up having a local priest dress up in prison guard clothing to try to see if he could get some answers out of him. Sure enough, Pedro was only too eager to discuss his crimes. Pedro eventually admitted to having murdered hundreds of girls across multiple countries.
I like the girls in Ecuador. They are more gentle and trusting, more innocent. They are not as suspicious of strangers as Colombian girls.
Pedro blamed his crimes on his tough childhood, claiming he found the need to find revenge on others because of what he experienced when he was only 8 and was kicked out of his home. He wanted to hurt as many girls as he could. He loved searching for his young female women during the light of day and would capture them at night. He would then strangle them to death while taking advantage of them. He loved watching the light in their eyes go out. This not only caused him arousal, but deep pleasure as he came to experience the death of so many innocent girls who were completely defenseless. It would be years before he was finally brought behind bars and made to pay for his crimes. Despite the fact that Pedro had admitted to killing many young girls, the legal system still ended up coming up with a deal that benefited him. They told him as long as he could provide them with the location of some of his young victims, they would reduce his sentence. He agreed, and shortly, after more than 50 of his young female victims' remains were found. The victims ranged in age from 8 through 12 years old. Pedro was then charged with many counts of murder. Pedro was later convicted and sentenced to life in jail, but he ended up getting released towards the end of 1998. Even upon his release, Pedro was absolutely obsessed with the thought of killing women and watching life leave their eyes. It gave him such a sense of power and longing. He absolutely loved the process of killing innocent women because they knew no better and simply had no way of defending themselves. He only enjoyed this killing experience if he could truly watch the girl pass away. Eventually, Pedro was arrested as an illegal immigrant and determined insane. Unfortunately, he ended up paying bail and getting released, free to continue the harm of others until the day of his death. This is the strange story of Alexander Pichushkin, a heartless killer. He was born in Moscow in April of 1974. His early life was relatively normal, from a freak accident that happened when he was young. He was injured while playing on a swing and hit his head, resulting in a brain injury. It is believed that his prefrontal cortex was damaged as a result of this injury. This part of the brain helps moderate aggression and impulsivity. This accident very well could have impacted the rest of his life and contributed to the horrific killer that he would later become. Because Alexander was just a young child when this accident occurred and he had such little padding in his head, it affected him far more than it would have if he was an adult. His life changed dramatically. He had to be switched out of his normal school and attend one that was for children with disabilities. He became aggressive, angry, and hostile. He was bullied by other children because of his mental problems. Despite Alexander's disability, he was an intelligent child, something that his grandfather recognized. Alexander's grandfather felt that his grandson's new school was far too obsessed with overcoming his disability than actually learning and fostering his intelligence. Eventually, he would take Alexander in to live with him. Alexander's grandfather wanted him to focus on learning new skills and taking interests in things outside of school. He taught him many things, one of which was how to play chess. He was shockingly good, despite his young age, and would often play against grown men. For a while, things in his life greatly improved as he had finally found something he enjoyed and was passionate about. Playing chess also helped him get his aggression back under control. Unfortunately, Alexander's grandfather would eventually pass away, and he would begin to struggle again. He was still getting bullied by mainstream children because of his disability, and he had to be moved back home to live with his mother again. As a way of trying to cope with the pain, not only of losing his beloved grandfather and the bullying, Alexander started drinking a lot of liquor. He would spend his time playing chess with older men and drinking. At this point, Alexander had begun some violent tendencies. Whenever he would come into contact with young children, he would threaten them while recording the whole thing on video. This made him feel more in control and powerful. By 1992, he was already on a murder rampage. He killed his own classmate with a hammer and buried his body. His next victim was a man who was dating a girl named Olga, someone that he was romantically interested in that had rejected him. Alexander made the man's death appear as an accident. After a long break, Alexander began killing again in 2001. His next kill began with a casual game of chess in the park with a 52-year-old man. Alexander lured the man into the woods, claiming that he wanted to visit the location of his dog's burial site in honor of the anniversary of the dog's death. But Alexander would ultimately use a bottle of vodka to strike him in the head and kill him. He then buried the body in a well. Between 2001 and 2005, Alexander attacked a whopping 36 victims. Only a few survived. Some of them he didn't even bother to properly bury or dispose of. He used a vodka bottle to kill and maim many of his victims. He would later say that killing others made him feel powerful, and as if he was God. Alexander's murder spree would come to an end in 2006 after a particularly bold killing. He convinced one of his co-workers, a girl named Marina, to go for a walk with him. Marina agreed to go, but she had a bad feeling about it. She even left a note behind for her son that said where she was going and who she was going with. It also had Alexander's phone number on it. Alexander knew that she had left the note, but it didn't hold him back from taking her life. Her body was later found in the park, where Alexander would often play chess. The police looked at surveillance footage from the metro and were able to see Alexander and Marina together, and he was arrested. While in custody, he ended up confessing to many of his other murders, and even helped lead police to where some of the bodies were located. You'll be relieved to know that, unlike the other killers on this list, Alexander is not on the loose. But his crimes were so horrific that we felt we had to include him on this list. He ended up being convicted of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. Shockingly, he ended up asking the court to add 11 more victims to his conviction, bringing his murder count up to 60. A judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and with the first 15 years spent in solitary confinement. It was deemed that Alexander was evil, but not mentally ill, and was fit to serve his sentence. Today he is 48 and remains behind bars where he will stay until the day of his death.